Good afternoon and welcome to the 2000 AD panel. Good house, excellent. Okay, so my name is David Bishop. I was editor of 2000 AD from Christmas 95 through to the year summer 2000. And I will be asking the questions. And the first question is, I would like to ask each of our esteemed panel today to introduce themselves and tell us about your most recent work in 2000 AD.
I'm Robbie Morrison. I write Shikara, quite a lot of Judge Dredd, and probably my most recent thing in 2000 AD would have been the final episode of Nikolai Dante.
My name is Dan Abnett. I write Sinister Dexter and Kingdom and Grey Area, and have written some of the classic characters as well. And Sinister Dexter would have been my last stuff, a run of it's just finished.
My name is Jim Murray. I illustrated the Batman Judge Dredd crossover Die Laughing, a bunch of Dredd stuff in the mid-90s, and the most recent thing for 2000 AD has been Christmas Dredd story in 2004, I think, so a while back, but I have fond memories. So.
Jim's here under entirely false pretenses, it would seem.
Hi, my name's Warren Pleece. I'm an artist I've worked on a couple of series for 2000 AD. One called, the first one was about back in 2004, called Second City Blues, and more recently I've just finished I think the third series of a series called Dandridge, written by Alec Worley, that came finished a few months ago.
Okay, good, thank you. Let's just do a quick test of the audience. How many people here have been reading since the first prog? Thank you.
None of us.
Just a quick test. Okay, so we'll start with Warren. What's your first memory of 2000 AD? When did you first encounter it?
I think I was 11 or 12, and I went to my local newsagents and I got the first issue. And I was steeped in kind of like British comics at the time. I think the one that really stuck in my mind before that was Action. I used to love all that hook jaw and sharks eating people and gore. And I think my dad actually banned me from reading it because there was some kind of national outrage in the Daily Mail or something. Not that you read the Daily Mail or anything, but and so when Action finished, there wasn't really anything to kind of take its place. And then I seem to remember like 2000 AD came out, and it was like it was all the great stuff that I really liked, the kind of science fiction stuff like Star Wars that I was into at the time, in this kind of like a new comic. And it just, for me, it was just like just an inspiration. And like as I kind of grew up, it was one of the first comics I really remember reading and being really aware of the different artists and writers and the different styles, especially people like Brian Boland and Mike McMahon, and just kind of each week you'd see who was doing Judge Dredd, and it was like, oh no, it's him. Or next week, oh it's great, my favourite was. And just so many different different stories, like things like Flesh, or I really used to like Mark 1. It was a kind of like $6 Million Man kind of thing. And for me, like as a kid, that was my, it was just like an amazing kind of like experience. Like, comics that I loved, but also this brilliant kind of array of different kind of science fiction stories.
Jim.
Well, I was reading it in the mid-80s, and so my first experience of 2000 AD was sort of Robot Hunter, that kind of around Prog 400, something like that, 450, something, I don't know, that kind of era. I suppose it was ABC Warriors at that point. These are like early memories of reading it. Obviously, seeing Simon Bisley's work for the first time, that was pretty inspiring.
I think my very first experience of 2000 AD was Prog 9. I didn't quite get there for the first issue, but Prog 9, which I believe was the one with the Dredd looking at the old lady watering the singing heads in her garden,
Brain blooms.
Thank you. And that had a profound effect. Profound effect on me. I very much like Warren. I'd read. Well, actually, the comic I was allowed to read was Battle. I wasn't allowed to read Action because that was just battle, but with more blood.
Oh yeah, that's what.
Yeah, but my friend got Action, so I read that over his shoulder, and then when that got cancelled, then 2000 AD came along, and it is absolutely that. It was the strength of the characters that hooked me immediately. Dredd, obviously, but so many of the others. The conceptual strength of the worlds, each individual universe, the fact that each issue had 5 or 6 different universes in it that were each one very well realised and extremely well sort of rendered, and that the quality of the art, again, I agree completely. It was noticing individual talent and seeing that in fact, I didn't have a least favourite Dredd artist. I liked the fact that there were different Dredd artists. That it was Bolland, that it was Cam Kennedy, it was Esquerra, whoever was drawing it. It was an amazing vision, and I guess the. I like Flesh as well, but I think my favourite series, I'm not quite sure how long it was before it arrived, was the VCs, which I actually ended up getting to write later on. But that was Cam Kennedy and Gary Leach, wasn't it? I think alternating on that, and I loved that series. Again, because of the technology and the ideas.
Was the first issue advertised in television by any chance? No?
I think it was.
Yeah, because I seem to remember that, and I seem to remember that a friend of mine, and this would be like, I don't know, primary 2, primary 3, turning up because it was advertised with what was the
Space
spinner, the space spinner, which on the TV advert looked brilliant. And I remember one of my pals turning up in primary school with a space spinner and throwing it, and it's a piece of paper. It doesn't even go very far. So I thought, I'm not buying that comic. And but then didn't actually pick up. I probably picked up the first issue. I remember. I have no idea of the issue number, but the Brian Bolland Judge Dredd strip in it, in which all the various it was Jack the Ripper and Quasimodo and all these people were running around Mega City 1 committing murders and causing chaos.
We're all looking at you now.
Yeah.
Pass.
Okay.
It turned out they were robotic museum artifacts that had went crazy, and I thought, right, the artwork was lovely, and it just struck me. It was a kind of bonkers story that had all these Victorian London and villains running around this science fiction city. It always stuck with me.
There's an old saying in the 2000 AD editorial office, which is that every prog has its dog, indicating there's almost always one story which is maybe not quite the equal of all the others, just possibly. So is there, when you were growing up, was there one story you tended to skip over, possibly? I'll ask Robbie first.
I can't really remember, actually.
Be honest.
I honestly can't really remember the early stuff. I can remember later stories that I would have skipped through when I was a freelancer and reading it, but I probably shouldn't mention any of them or mention any names. Not that any of them are sitting near me or anything.
I don't think I don't remember. I think the only time I would have skipped a story was because they put, as it were, the wrong artist on it. If they put a filler artist on something, and it wasn't that there was anything wrong with the artist, it wasn't. But my pleasure in the strip was taken away because it wasn't the person who should be drawing it. I think that was the only occasion. I don't remember sort of heartily disliking stories because I didn't think they were of appropriate quality. It was more a case of I prefer military SF to whatever. It was a personal preference. I do know that I was responsible for a series. Well, we were responsible for a series called Sancho Panza, which seemed like a terribly good idea at the time, and there's never, ever, ever, ever have I received so much criticism for. So I was the dog in that issue.
It had lovely artwork.
It had lovely artwork, yeah.
The joy of comics, there's always some redeeming feature to be had from almost anything.
Yeah.
Personally, I quite like it, but there you go. Then again, I did commission it, so that's possibly not a surprise. Jim?
There's probably nothing specific that I would...
It's so nice on this panel.
Except, I would agree. Anything that I've done in the comic, I definitely would flick to the next strip,
Yeah, it's usually my own stuff that I just will skip over.
We're just all modest, that's what it is.
Oh.
Self-deprecating.
and yet you decided to sit up here in front of people and talk at them.
On a red chair.
You're really hung up on that red chair,
Really
aren't
am,
you?
yeah. I don't know why I'm singled out.
Okay. This is a question for Jim and Warren, for the artists on the panel. Was there one particular artist whose work inspired you to start drawing yourself? Doesn't have to be 2080, but any particular artist that chimed for you and made you pick up a pencil and start copying, or?
I think for me it was Brian Boland, because especially when he did Judge Dredd, it was like at that age, the whole kind of everything to be real and kind of like realistic, but what he was really good at was like the kind of modelling and the kind of like dark and light, and subsequently it's kind of what, when I went on to kind of like produce my own stuff, which is kind of very influenced by kind of film and kind of lighting techniques, it's like, I guess I was kind of, maybe without really realising it, I was quite very inspired by his stuff. Of course, he can draw much better than I can. It's like, and technically, as a draftsman, he's like just amazing. And I think when I was a kid, about 12, his stuff just really shone out for me. I mean, there's so many great artists on 2000, like Dave Gibbons, and there's just like, there's just a countless kind of array of brilliant artists and writers, just with all different styles. And I think that as a publication, that's what it was, one of its real strengths, was like, you could really see so many different styles and different ways of telling stories. But yeah, definitely Brian Boland for me, because the way he drew Dredd, and the Judge Death and the Cursed Earth, and just the weird little stories where you'd have characters like Laurel and Hardy with Laurel and Hardy masks. I can't remember that one, where they were kind of, there was the Three Stooges and as bank robbers, and they're just like just great stuff. Really, he was the guy.
I would say early inspiration was Mike McMahon. It was just amazing, just beautiful, loose artwork, really expressive. And also perhaps Ian Gibson. And he did a later series called The Taxidermist, which was quite amusing. So when I first started though with you, on the magazine, I think Frank Whiteley was definitely the biggest influence on my work. So I think my learning curve just shot right up just by trying to figure out how he was doing stuff.
Okay, and for the writers, are there any particular stories that made you think, I want to write stories like this? I mean, it sounds like maybe the VCs for Dan, possibly.
Yeah, the VCs definitely, and I think some of the they're so obvious to point out, but those early Dredd classics like sort of The Day the Lord Died and Cursed Earth and The Judge Child, which were absolutely sort of incredibly formative. The idea of an epic story with individual episodes within, just really, I think, sort of inspired me to want to write. I think that because it combined both the wonderful sort of serialised nature of a British comic, that sort of 5 pages a week anthology thing, with the scope of a monthly American comic, because it was over a long period. So you had sort of a greater architecture of storytelling as it goes on. But I think even as a writer, though, I was equally inspired by the artists. I mean, I think I wanted to write because I wanted to write stories for those artists to draw. I really admire what Pat Mills's incredible imagination and John Wagner's incredible strength of storytelling, both of which I think are fabulous, but it's what they then propelled the artists to do. So I absolutely agree with their picks of artists. And also to me, Cam Kennedy, Colin Wilson, I loved Colin Wilson's work on Dredd, and Kev O'Neill, who probably to me is the one who defines that completely anarchic nature of 2000 AD visuals best of all. I think things like very early Nemesis stories and stuff like that. We'd never seen anything like that at all, and I'm not quite sure how. Even to this day, I'm not quite sure how they were written for in the first place, because it was coming sort of out of his head. But it was So it was a combination of the two, I think.
Well, I was a big fan of the writers T.B. Grover and Alvin Gaunt until I discovered they weren't actually real, and it was pseudonyms for John Wagner and Alan Grant. And for years I could probably, I always said Alan Grant's running Strontium Dog was I loved that. And then I discovered that actually, and John Wyden was writing Dredd, but then I discovered they were actually co-writing the same stuff at the time, so they were both responsible, so I can't really choose between them now. As for a strip that sticks in my mind, probably some of the early Robo-Hunter stuff. Is it Day of the Droids? Where it's just crazy, wacky, kind of anarchic plotting, and you literally didn't know what was going to happen from one episode to the next, but it made sense in its own crazy world. There's about the sequence I remember is like Sam Slade, Robo-Hunter, was being chased by 4 Sam Slade robots, and he runs into this dance hall or something, and he says, right, I've got to hide from them, so he jumps on the dance floor and he's dancing with one of the thingy, and a robot woman dancer. It sounds ridiculous, but it was brilliant. And as he's dancing, somebody says, couple number 9, please leave the room, and he's like, holy shit, it's an eliminator. So he starts dancing much better than everybody else, while the Sam Slade assassins that have been following him are standing at the side, and they're waiting to kill him, but they're also standing there saying, you got to hand it to us, we're good. It was just crazy. And there was, at the time, there was nothing else like that in comics. The American comics were, they might have been quite good fun, but they didn't have that. They didn't seem to have that line of just, ridiculous invention. That.
Okay, so all of you have worked on 2000 AD, but at sort of different stages in your careers as it sort of entered your career, the comic. So I'll start with Robbie. At what stage? How did you come to work on 2000 AD, and at what stage in your career did that happen?
Very early. It was probably the second place that pretty much bought anything from me. Well, no, sorry. I suppose I started in the magazine, which was the 2000 AD's sister publication. So I'd worked in the magazine for quite a while, and then writing Judge Dredd and other things like that. But I think Steve McManus eventually approached me to see if I would be interested in doing a series for 2000 AD, which was Nikolai Dante. So it was still fairly early in my career, I'd say, yeah.
I worked for Marvel UK on staff in the mid-80s. That was my first job editorially. And there was a sort of trajectory that most writers, and indeed British writers and artists, followed, which is that they would start off doing kids' licensed product for things like Marvel UK. Then they would work for 2000 AD, and that's where they would show how brilliant they were. And then they would get headhunted by American comics, usually DC. And then that was the arc that everybody seemed to follow. And so deliberately and perversely, I didn't do that. No, I accidentally didn't do that. But I worked for Marvel UK. I wrote for them, and then I went freelance as a writer, and I worked for Marvel US and DC and just about everybody else. And finally, in the mid-90s, got commissioned to write for 2000 AD, which was a delight because I was still reading it. It was the one comic that I still read for pleasure rather than for sort of professional continuity purposes and everything like that. And the very first thing that I was asked to write was Judge Dredd, which was scary, frankly, because of the weight of great stories that had gone before. And in fact, very recently, earlier this year, we did there was a signing at Forbidden Planet in London. And it was a very rare occasion for Ron Smith to attend. And Ron Smith, obviously, in many respects, the unsung Judge Dredd artist, who he actually drew more than almost everybody else. And it was the guy who classically drew him with two pistols rather than one. That was an affectation of his. Ron was amazing, but I'd never met him before. And somebody they deliberately brought the first issue that everybody had contributed to get their autographs in. And when mine arrived, I knew the first thing I'd ever written was Judge Dredd, but I didn't realise that it was one of Ron's last jobs as Dredd artist. So that was a very weird experience to see that there. And then it turned out that Ben Wilshire, the first thing he'd done was something I'd written. So there was this weird generational strangeness going on, which I won't dwell on. But it was a very. I think quite quickly I then did a lot of Tharg's. What are they called? Vector 13s, yeah. Which was the equivalent of the Future Shocks at the time. The sort of, and then bizarrely gave birth to Sinister Dexter.
Jim.
Yeah. So working. In fact, you were the one who commissioned me first, coming straight out of college, to work on a magazine to start with. And I think I did a cover on 2000 AD fairly early on in my career. It was a Slaine cover, I think. But yeah, it was pretty much my first job. And like I said, my learning curve was rocketing at that point, and the early stories were pretty dire, pretty ropey. But yeah, I mean, it certainly formed the way I look at my career. So that's basically the place where I learned most of my the skills which I use now every day. So.
Slightly different for me because I kind of got my first proper job in comics working on Crisis, which was the sister publication to 2000 AD back in late 80s, and through Steve McManus, who was, former editor of 2000 AD. And for me it was kind of weird because I was, I grew up in 2000 AD, and the idea that one day I could also be an artist for 2000 AD, and there I was just like next door to 2000 AD doing Crisis, like thinking, when's the 2000 AD job going to come? So anyway, from the Crisis job, I kind of went on to do stuff for DC Comics and DC Vertigo for a good, 15 years. So in a roundabout way, it was only through doing that part of my career there that I kind of ended up doing 2000 AD when the work for DC Comics slightly dried up. And so I had a kind of weird trajectory of like starting near 2000 AD, going away from it and then coming back and start doing some stuff in 2004, so with Second City Blues. So
Got you in the end.
Yeah, got me in the end.
I was actually going to ask you a question slightly off the 2000 AD route, but about True Faith, which was the Crisis strip that you did with Garth, which has a certain notoriety to it for the fact that the graphic novel collection was pulped, withdrawn from sale and pulped and wasn't available for years afterwards. So can you tell us what actually happened and what your experience of that was like, being one of the rare pulped British creators?
It was great. It was kind of weird because True Faith was serialised in Crisis, so I was basically producing some. Garth Ennis, who wrote it, had written the script, and he'd previously done Troubled Souls. So and Steve McManus, I think, was keen for Garth to do a new series, and they loved what he'd written, and for some reason they chose me from some samples I did, and through, I guess, from the work that I did on my own magazine called Velocity, and I was just like using my kind of artistic painterly techniques that I'd kind of played around with at art college and bringing those into kind of my line art that I was doing for comics. So it's complete kind of weird, a kind of coincidence or a kind of mistake that I was kind of creating this style for the actual story, but it kind of seemed to work for the actual story when it came out. So it was serialised for each fortnight, and then about 6 months afterwards they decided to produce it as a graphic novel, and the process seemed to go on for ages and ages, and I didn't know what was taking so long. But when eventually it was out, it was all a bit of a relief. Someone who shall remain nameless, I think, decided it would be a great idea as a kind of PR stunt to send this kind of book about a guy who loses his mind and blames God and religion and the churches and goes around burning churches, to send this book about a teenager who gets into this kind of weird kind of terroristic kind of like church burning situation, to send that book to loads of religious groups as a kind of publicity stunt. And at that time, I think Fleetway IPC was owned by Robert Maxwell, the newspaper proprietor. And for some reason, I don't know how this happened, but of course these two of these Christian groups were against it. And I did hear that even Mary Whitehouse herself took a kind of offence to it, which is like, it's always been my kind of claim to fame, I was pulped by Robert Maxwell and kind of banned by Mary Whitehouse. I think that's, everything else has been downhill from there. So, and basically, after all this kind of build-up and for this graphic novel to be pulped, was like, oh my God, But then it was only about 4 years later, DC Vertigo bought the rights to it, and thanks to Garth's kind of status at DC, and it was kind of produced, and they did a much better job, and there was no kind of like controversy at all. And we're talking America as well, yeah, we all think as like the kind of Bible bashing, kind of like God-fearing kind of nation in America, but they didn't have any trouble with like this so-called controversy. So kind of interesting.
Available in the bookshop after this session. Okay, the next question's for Robbie. You've created and written series for 2000 AD such as Nikolai Dante and the wonderfully bonkers Shikara. But you've also written for characters created by other people, particularly Judge Dredd in 2000 AD. So, given a choice between writing your own characters and writing pre-created characters, which is your preference and why?
Oh, I'm probably much happier writing my own characters. Because then you really only have to please yourself with what you're doing, and I'm very easily pleased. If you're working in Dredd or anything like that, that's great fun as it is. I always feel when I'm writing Dredd that you're just sort of marking time for John Wagner coming back to the series while he takes a break in Barbados or whatever he's doing, and you can't. I mean, I like to usually when I write stuff, I like to be able to change the status quo or take it on, or have kill off characters or let them live, whatever. In Dredd, there are always certain limitations you can't step out of. And also when you write your own stuff, you don't then sort of live in fear of a big hand falling on your shoulder and sort of John Wagner leaning in at some convention saying, "That last Dredd you wrote was shite." So really I just try, doing Dredd, you always try, aim for that kind of quality. Whether or not you manage it is for other people to judge.
Yes, I always remember John once phoned up the office to complain about somebody's fill-in effort on Judge Dredd, and his exact phrase was, "Stop this unspeakable practice." They did. Okay, Jim, you're mostly working in computer games now, but did your apprenticeship, as you mentioned, on the Judge Dredd magazine before you worked on 2000 AD. So how useful was the experience of having to invent new characters and new concepts and worlds on a weekly or fortnightly basis now that you're doing it as in computer games?
Yeah, it was extremely formative. It was difficult to explain, really. I mean, so the experience of making comics is so completely different from games. Games is much more collaborative in a way. I know, writers and artists have a collaboration together, but at the same time, my memories of comics are basically you're on your own, you hand in something, and then 2 weeks later you see it on the shelf, and it's an awesome experience. But it's just a leap of faith when you're in, you're drawing out that stuff, and you're just hoping you're going to get it right, basically, and no one's going to turn around and give you crap for it, which you did on many occasions, if I remember right.
It's a dirty job. Dan, you're possibly the most versatile writer I know.
Thank you very much.
Working in comics. Could you attempt to list for us the various stories you've worked on this year across sundry media? And then, after that should fill up the rest of the session. And then tell us why you do so many different things.
Because no one's found me out yet, if I answer the second bit first. This year, Sinister Dexter and Grey Area and Kingdom and Insurrection, the Judge Dredd strip for the magazine. I've been working on some Superman stories for DC and finished off my Vertigo series, The New Dead Wardians. A series called Hypernaturals for Boom in America. Working on a game that I can't tell anybody about. Writing Warhammer novels and other shooty death kill in space for Black Library. So Horus Heresy, Gaunt's Ghosts, that kind of thing. And stuff. Other stuff. Why do I do that? I've always found that I flourish under pressure. So if I've got slightly too little to do, I don't do it very well. Whereas if I've got slightly too much to do, I focus and produce what I consider to be better work. Who knows? But that is it. And also, if I do one thing for too long, I get stuck in it. So I almost literally on a daily basis get up in the morning, write a bit of a novel, a corner, a chapter or two of a novel, whatever the current novel is, and then I'll switch to comics in the afternoon, just so that I don't get bogged down in anything. Occasionally, if it's going really, really well, I know it'd be foolish to stick to that. And I think I love writing novels. I've now written a fair number of them, and it's something I enjoy doing very, very much. And I really enjoy. And this is a terrible slight to comics, so hang on. But I really enjoy the fact that, apart from the fact that obviously they get copy edited and they get edited, a novel is the closest way of connecting with readership, because essentially what I write is what the reader reads, and therefore that process is not put through any particularly obvious filters like being interpreted by an artist. I'm not saying that is, and that's why it sounds like a slight. That's why it's very good fun from a novelist's point of view to do that, to know that you're directing that message in them. But it's not necessarily better in terms of the end product, it's just an artistically satisfying thing to do. Get me. But working, the reason, and I enjoy that so much that you'd think by now I would have stopped writing comics, because I've done lots and I've done that, and now I find this thing that I find very, very satisfying. But there is also this immense satisfaction about that collaborative process, about wondering how somebody's going to take that script. And also, quite often with 2000 AD and American comics, you know in advance who you're writing for, and what that artist's strengths and weaknesses are likely to be, and what sort of thing they really enjoy doing. In fact, I love to be able to get on the phone or an email to an artist that I know I'm going to be working with and say, almost, what do you want to draw? Because within reason, I can probably fit it into the story somewhere, and then it'll be something that you're going to sort of thrive on, and that is great. And I can't. It's kind of hooked to that. So I still write comics and find time to write comics because I enjoy that collaborative process. Freelance writing and art, like many things that you do, there's a danger of cabin fever. You can go stir crazy. We know many artists, particularly, who've left the reservation, and the opportunity, therefore, to be able to talk to somebody, or to at least have a dialogue with somebody, a creative dialogue with somebody in those circumstances, I think is great, and it's kept me sane.
Yes, when I was an editor, we used to call it LFS, and it was for writers and artists, frankly. It's called Lonely Freelancer Syndrome, in that they're sat at home all day on their own, either writing or drawing, and you get them on the phone, and honestly, some of them, it was like, put your feet up, you're going to be here for a couple of hours. You're the only human they've talked to this week. Or this year, in some cases. Okay, this is a question for everybody, but we'll start with Robbie. Sorry, this is the inevitable endurance question. 2000 AD celebrated its 36th anniversary this year. Why do you think it's still going?
To be honest, I think it has a loyal core of fans that have been buying it from very early on, and they continue to buy it. I think that's mainly it. And hopefully it also comes in that it's still producing good material. Not every story will appeal to everybody, but that's the beauty of an anthology sometimes, that you can throw in something that might not appeal to everybody but might have some of its own value. So I just actually, to be honest, I'll just forget with that. I have no idea how it's still going. Every other bloody comic has bit the dust, so I have no idea how 2000 AD is still going, but good that it is.
Dan.
Yes, it's got a very loyal following, a devoted following, in fact, and I think it's got a large enough devoted following to have made it actually a proper institution rather than just a popular comic. So I think it supports itself in a way, in as much as people come to it because they've heard about it and they want to know what it is. I think it's survived because it has retained its core strengths, the anthology strengths, but also the core strengths of imagination and very often satire and social commentary that it's always had right from the word go. Done in a completely different way these days, but still there. It is the most amazing showcase, imaginative showcase, I think, particularly on the art side, that extraordinary things go on. And the fact that because it is an anthology and because it's gone on for such a long time and because so many different people have worked on it in different phases, it is absolutely not the same thing it was, except it is. Spiritually it is, but it is lensed through our eyes now. So it's never got the opportunity to get stale, as far as I'm concerned, because it's always renewing itself, finding new things to do, bringing in new talent, inventing new characters and stories, and respecting its own traditions. That's my theory. It's not a very good one.
Jim?
Dredd.
Nicely played. Warren?
What they said. No, I agree. I think that is the case. You know, it hasn't always been the same. I mean, we're talking about when we first kind of got into 2000 or first read it, and it's completely different in a lot of ways, but I guess it has, because of so many different people who come in and different writers and different types of artists. I guess the art is maybe kind of, you know, it's more what you see across, you know, like similar to what you see at DC. But I think there's still a tendency in 2000 AD to mix up different styles and different writing techniques and just keeping that tradition of like completely out there ideas, you know, which is what I always connected with as a kid, and I think maybe that's still the case. Yeah. So.
Okay. Now, some of you have worked on more 2000 AD material than others, but this is a question, and we'll start Warren this time. If you could write or draw any character in 2000 AD that you haven't had the opportunity to do from 36 years of history, what would you like to do?
Well, I think every artist says Dredd, because I've never done a Dredd. I mean, the last time I did a Judge Dredd, I was 12, and it was in the back of my rough school book, you know, in the back. And but I would probably like to do Judge Death. I don't know. I just thought that character was brilliant. So, please, anyone.
Jim.
That's a really tough question. Probably something like Robo Hunter. That'd be fun. I think lots of fun characters.
I was going to say Strontium Dog, but technically I have written that, so because of Durham Red. But I guess Strontium Dog, if we can get Carlos to draw it, because that would be the fun part of doing that, was to capture that spirit of it. Not that I want to take work away from people, but that would be the dream, I think.
He just stole my answer. Yeah, the original Johnny Alpha Strontium Dog. Before they killed him off and brought him back, the original in black and white on the crappy paper. Yeah, certainly. I would have been maybe tough between that and Robo Hunter, because I enjoyed Robo Hunter. In fact, Andy Diggle kept trying to get me to revamp Robo Hunter, but every time I sat down and looked at the the Day of the Droids, I thought, if I can't match this or get any better, then no. So I kept turning them down, which was probably silly looking back on it.
And for this one, is there any artist or writer that you've always wanted to work with but haven't had the chance yet? Robbie?
I've been pretty lucky with artists, I have to say, over the years, but Carlos or Cam Kennedy, yeah, the two of them are just classic artists. I can't think of it. Or Brian Bolland, or Mick. Actually, I have worked with Mick McMahon, so I've crossed him off. But yeah, one of those three.
He's stolen my answer now, so that's it. No, or Kev O'Neill or Colin Wilson.
Well, I have worked with Colin Wilson.
There you go. You couldn't answer that then, could
Yeah.
you?
Well, I've worked with Robbie, so I have to say Dan.
Crawler.
We're all so diplomatic.
I was going to say Robbie and Dan, but change your mind.
Okay, I've got time. I think I've got time for about one or two more questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience, because we may have one or two questions lurking in the audience. He said, hopefully. If not, it'll just be me talking. Oh yes. Rejection is a fact of life for most comic creators. At some point in your life, you will have pitched the story or an idea to either a writer or to an artist or to an editor, and it just hasn't got off the ground. I certainly know I've rejected work from some of you over the years. So are there any particular strips that you wish editors had bought into, or that you wish you'd had the chance to do, which didn't happen? You can't remember any, can you? They've all been lost to the mists of time.
I wish you hadn't commissioned Sancho Panza.
I still like it. It's perfectly fine.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I probably wish hadn't been commissioned. We chatted about this yesterday, but it was actually mostly for the magazine, the Brits at Britain. Oh, God, even the name. Crawling horror.
Sumos and sporrans.
I kind of still got a soft spot for it. But you said you were going to try and get Cam Kennedy to draw it, and it would have worked then. Unfortunately, it wasn't Cam that drew it.
Not even close, really.
Well, no.
Okay, and my last question, before we throw it over to the audience, is when I was editing 2000 AD, we had the slight issue of what to call 2000 AD after the year 2000, which haunted me for 4.5 years, and which eventually I left the comic to avoid having to answer that question ever again, and left it to my successor Andy Diggle to try and answer, because nobody had a good answer. So if you had the job of trying to rename 2000 AD, what would you have called it instead of 2000 AD?
It's not my suggestion. It was Deborah Tate, who's in the office once, in here once said to me they should have called it 20,000 AD, and I think that would have solved all the problems, and nobody would have had to resign to avoid answering the question in another, thousands of years.
18,000 years.
Yeah. I couldn't do the maths there. I'm a writer, give me a break.
I never saw what the problem was, because Exhibit A, 20th Century Fox, Exhibit B, Radio Times. I mean, if something is extremely well known for being called something, don't worry about changing it. That would have been my answer. It would have saved you a lot of pain, that wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it was the fact it was meant to be a futuristic comic, but it was an anachronistic name was the issue there. Any suggestions from the far end?
I always thought, why not just call it 3000 AD? It's like, but maybe if you're talking about going up forward, maybe it should have been 1900 or something. Just,
I quite fancy 1900 AD.
Well,
Steampunk.
well, thinking about how 2000 AD then was all very kind of like just, weird, out there stories. It would have made sense, to go back.
The other great anachronism for those who haven't seen it is the Australian Woman's Weekly. It's monthly. But they can't change the name because the brand is so well established. They just went, they'll never notice. Still getting away with it after all these years. Okay, so yes, we have about 9 minutes for any questions, and possibly a microphone may pass around. Oh, there we are. Now, I'm not going to make the mistake I made yesterday of trying to identify anybody by gender. So I'll just say that person with their hand up and assume that you're all people. I know that person over there.
Not a question for anyone in particular, but it never really struck me as coincidental that 2000 AD was born at the same time as punk rock. And I wondered if there was something about the subculture or that time that led to both things happening at once.
I'm sure there was, but I was probably only about 8 at the time, so I didn't have the spiky hair or the tartan trousers I wasn't really aware of it, but yeah, I certainly think it tapped into something of that period. It certainly had an anarchic spirit, which appealed to the kids who were reading it.
I think a lot of the guys that were working at it were kind of pretty much older than would be acceptable to be a punk, But it kind of that whole era was like, it was full of that kind of change and stuff going on. Star Wars, punk rock, 2000 AD, all seemed to kind of just merge pretty well. So.
I think 2000 AD in its various heydays throughout its life has always been very of the zeitgeist. I think it was always so the fact that it would be born out of that kind of thing, and that was a particularly, what's the word, iconoclastic thing if you're going to inspire invention and satire and undermining authority and that kind of stuff, then that was the way to go. And I hadn't thought that was a very nice way of putting it. It's you've got punk rock there and Star Wars happening over here, and what you take science fiction and give it spiky hair, and you've got
you've got the Brotherhood of Man on the other side of
yes.
And Dirty Harry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue, having edited 2000 AD, for better or for worse at times, actually, 2000 AD is always better when it tries to lead rather than it tries to follow. Whenever 2000 AD has followed trends, it's usually gone the worse for it. It's far better if it strikes out on its own and does what it wants to do at that moment in time. Good. Any other questions? Now, all the way down here, I'm terribly sorry. You couldn't have sat together, could you? That's true.
Hello? Is this working?
Yeah.
Cool. 2000 AD is an anthology, and each of the stories is 4 to 6 pages in length. And I was just wondering, every issue, even if it's part of an overall storyline, you still need to fit it in so that each story feels like it's sort of complete in its own instalment. So how's that work? How do you manage to do that, artists and writers, compared to the longer form stuff?
Okay, so the question was, how do you manage to fit what feels like a complete story into only somewhere between 4 and 6 pages often, even if it's an episode and a longer story?
That formative training I got at Marvel UK always instilled upon me the traditional comic values of making sure that every issue can be somebody's first issue. So I have always written everything, whether it's episodes of stuff for 2000 AD or issues of stuff for American comics or whatever, assuming that it's the first time somebody's picked that particular thing up, even if it's part 8 of a much longer story. So I quite laboriously will make sure that even on a 5-page format, there is a beginning, middle and ending, and anybody who's in that story gets name checked so that you at least know who they are and what they're called. The stories, admittedly with something like Sinister X, are often subtly convoluted, so that you might need to read several of them to get the hang of it, but I want to give the reader as much information as possible to make them want to stay the course. And like I said, have a good way of coming in. So it has a beginning, it has a title, it has an upbeat in the middle, and it comes to a cliffhanger at the end, which is the same thing you'd do on a 22-page American issue. I have to say, and there are people who don't do this now because everybody is so aware of the fact that almost all comic book material, including stuff in 2000 AD, is going to be collected and put out as a trade paperback, and that's where its longevity comes. In fact, that's part of an answer to the earlier question about why is 2000 AD surviving, is because its back catalogue is now available in a way it never used to be. But I think it's terribly sad, particularly in American comics, where you buy the latest issue of whatever it is, and it's just the next 20 pages of a story, and there is no sense of that sort of timing and craft that this is the next act, and therefore it will have a proper beginning and it will have these things in it, because it means it reads splendidly when you collect it together as a so-called graphic novel. But it misses. I think that's one of the reasons that the sort of the periodical market is sort of dying out, because you don't get that great fix of an episode. If you go into a comic book shop today and try and pick up, not all, there are some notable exceptions, but an American comic, if it's in the middle of a story, you probably won't have a clue what's going on. Because there's no plot or dramatic structure within that to show you where it is. It's just, like I said, it's just the next 20 pages, which make beautiful sense at the end of it. But as I say, I think most 2000 AD writers try and preserve that sense of each episode as a self-contained episode, even if it's part of a bigger thing. And that sometimes can take up a lot of space. If you've only got 5 pages, by the time you've got in, you've only had time to do one thing before you've got to get out again. But then that was the whole idea. It's each week it was another fix of something dramatic happened. So.
I was just going to ask Warren, actually. I'm interested in the fact your latest graphic novel, Montague Terrace, is told in a series of some quite short stories within that. I mean, why did you, rather than you've got a contract from Cape to do a graphic novel, why did you choose to do short stories as a choice, as a medium?
Because of the setting in Montague Terrace is a kind of residential block. I think what attracted me and my brother Gary to write stories about these people is like we had a wealth of stories to tell. So you could tell stories about a kind of crap magician who actually has a magic rabbit who talks to him, or does he? And things like that. So, but you can mix it up with a kind of an intense story about an Iraqi interpreter. So it's like, rather than just kind of have this one kind of narrative going all the way through, it's like the potential to have lots of different stories is actually, I don't know, more rewarding and more fulfilling. And I think what you were saying earlier about how do you do that, I think, like Dan said, it's like a skill that you develop. But I guess you could think of it as like breaking it up into chapters. Like you can talk about Dickens, would publish kind of chapter 1, and people would get that edition of chapter 1, and then a month later chapter 2 would come out, and then eventually all of that would be Great Expectations or something, and then they'd go to a kind of binder and they get it kind of, I'm all for like the idea of kind of going back to that kind of sense of anthology, or kind of like telling stories in a surrealistic kind of form. I find that kind of interesting, not knowing what's going to happen. These days, I guess, if you want to watch something, everything's on demand and it's instant, and you can rewind it if you didn't get something. But I think it's almost too easy. And the idea that, once a week there's a comic coming out, and that's going to be chapter 1 of that, or that's going to be part of that, and then you're going to have to wait another week. It's almost kind of torture, but I think as a kind of reader, that's kind of what makes it really special, is like not knowing and just having to wait and having to live your life until the next episode. For me, I've have grand visions of kind of going backwards into that kind of storytelling, because I kind of find that more fun, rather than just reading one single story all the way through.
Cool. I think we've got time for one very quick question. If you overrun here, it's death for the chair. I'm sorry, he just beat you to it.
We've had good movies and some, let's say, not so good movies from comic books in general. Why do you think that some movies from comics don't work, and which character would you like to have a movie made of?
We'll start with Robbie. Any particular character you'd like to see made into a movie, and why do you think some comic movies suck worse than others?
It just comes down to the script and the interpretation of the character, really, and some things work on screen, some things don't, I think, when it comes to comic book, really. But it always comes down to the script and the director and that. As for just for characters from 2000 AD, apart from selfishly any on my own, I'd probably say I think Robo Hunter would make a good, fun, general audience film. Even computer animated, and I think it would be a winner.
I think one of the other things that comic book movies stand or fall by is the idea of how famous the character is that they are basing the movie on. So if you've got a properly iconic character like, so we say, Batman, who never causes any kind of scandal on the internet at all, there is more at stake, and the creators have less liberty, the filmmakers have less liberty to muck around with what it constitutes Batman these days. Whereas if you take a character, say a 2000 AD character who's not necessarily very well known in the States, they may love the comic, but they may feel they can play around with it more, and that may indeed make a better movie, but it may not make a better movie version of that character. So that may be why films suck in different ways. Some films suck because they're just not very good. Some films suck because they're a great film, but not true to the original thing. I would say almost any 2000 AD. I mean, I'd love to see Flesh made as a movie. How fantastic would that be?
I'd like to see Nicola Dante made into maybe a TV series.
I'm thinking sort of
Just
HBO, Game of Thrones.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I can live with that, Jim.
Very magnanimous of you, Magnus. Yes. Warren, what you'd like to see made into a movie?
A Scott Trucking Company? Why not?
Yeah, I think computer generated for that one to get the full Ballard and Alley effect. I think that is all the time we have, so if you'd like to show your appreciation for our panelists. And I will now ask you to stay in your seats long enough for these gentlemen to leave, because they're going next door into the signing tent next door, and they'll be very happy to sign books that you have to buy before you can queue up, unless you brought your own. But if you let us leave first, otherwise it's an unholy crush. Thank you.
Well, 2000 AD has been running for about, I think this is its 36th year, and I've just been genuinely interested. And I didn't know who was going to be speaking today, so I was quite curious to see what members of the team that's involved with it would be basically at the event. So we had Dan Abnett, we had Robbie Morrison, we had Jim Murray, and we had Warren Pleece. And the only one, actually I didn't even know who, the only person I think I knew would be there would be Dan Abnett, and that was it. So it was a pleasant surprise to see everyone there. And I'm really loving the fact that Stripped is part of a book festival. So you get much more of a general audience popping by, and you have people, I mean, just this afternoon I heard someone say, I picked up my first graphic novel this week and now I'm reading 10, which is a great thing to hear, because it's something that's been underrated and there's all sorts of weird prejudices, and it's great to sort of see people sort of walk across that big border.
Well, I'm a big comic book fan. I have been for 35 years. And, coming to see some of the guys from 2000 AD is always a treat. Yeah, no, it was really good, really entertaining, and some good insight into some of their work. I think it's been really good. I mean, they take comic books very seriously in France, with the band Dezine. And it's really good that they're getting recognised for the fine art that it is.
I used to be a 2000 AD reader a long time ago, kind of. In the modern world, it's really difficult to keep up with comic strips and graphic novels and ordinary books and films and DVD and whatever. So I thought it might be interesting just to go along and see how the guys are. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's about time they did something like this, because Ian Rankin, who's here all the time, has contributed to graphic novels, and he's a fan. And so many graphic novel writers are Scottish, which is interesting. You always get great feedback from the Scottish writers as well, because I think they're much more humorous than everyone else. They always get good jokes.